distinguish the major features of glycolysis, Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, electron transport chain, and chemiosmosis. Glycolysis occurs in the cytosol, but the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain occur inside the mitochondria. Electron carriers such as NADH or nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide hydrogen produced during glycolysis, and the Krebs cycle pass their electrons to the electron transport chain, which results in synthesis of a lot of ATP. Nangyayari ang glycolysis sa cytosol. Pero ano nga ba ang glycolysis? Glycolysis is a cytoplasmic pathway which breaks down glucose into 2,3 carbon compounds and generates energy. Ang glycolysis ay nakakakuha ng chemical energy sa pamamagitan ng pag-oxidize ng glucose upang maging pyruvate. Glycolysis nets 2 ATP and 2 NADH. It supplies electrons via NADH to the transport chain. Mahalaga ang glycolysis sa cell dahil ang glucose ang pangunahing mapagkukunan ng fuel para sa mga tissue sa katawan. Halimbawa, ang glucose ay ang tanging mapagkukunan ng energy para sa utak. Upang matiyak ang normal na paggana ng utak, dapat panatilihin ng katawan ang equal na supply ng glucose sa dugo. Mahalaga rin ang glycolysis sapagkat ang metabolismo ng glucose ay gumagawa ng kapaki-pakinabang para sa iba pang mga metabolic pathway tulad ng pagbubuo ng mga amino acids o fatty acid. Krebs cycle is the cycle of chemical reactions that are major source of energy in living organisms. Krebs cycle o citric acid cycle is the next step of oxidation respiration. Nagaganap ito sa mitochondria. Ang acetyl enzyme ay nagbubuklod ng isang 4 na carbon molecule at gumagawa ng 6 na carbon molecule. Then 2 carbons are then removed as carbon dioxide. The 4 carbon starting materials are regenerated. The main difference between glycolysis and Krebs cycle is glycolysis is the first step involved in the cytoplasm of the cell, while Krebs cycle is the second process of respiration which occurs in the mitochondria of the cell. NADH or nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide hydrogen it is often referred to as coenzyme 1. NADH is the body's top-rank coenzyme, a facilitator of numerous biological reactions. NADH is necessary for cellular development and energy production. Mahalaga ito upang makagawa ng enerhiya mula sa pagkain at ito ang principal carrier ng mga electron sa proseso ng paggawa ng enerhiya sa mga cell. Ang mga electron transport chain NADH molecules ay nagdadala ng kanilang mga electron sa inner mitochondrial membrane kung saan inililipat nila ang mga electron sa isang serya ng mga protina na nauugnay sa laman. Glycolysis, Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, and electron transport chain is the 3 stages of cellular respiration. What is cellular respiration? Cellular respiration is an aerobic respiration. It enables some cells to produce ATP from a net release of energy to free energy absorbed from the surroundings with the help of oxygen. It is the oxidation of the foodstuffs to obtain energy.
So guys, gagamit ako ng table para maunawaan natin kung ano nga ba yung topic na i-discuss namin. So without any further ado, let's get to it. Glycolysis. It occurs in cytoplasm. What goes in glycolysis? As you can probably figure out in the name, glycolysis literally means cleaving or cutting. A simple sugar, so the sugar that we are cutting, in this case is the glucose. So glycolysis, in the word glycolysis, the lysis meaning splitting. Splitting up sugar or more specifically glucose. This process is anaerobic, which is do not require a presence of oxygen. The major product of glycolysis is a molecule known as pyruvate. While glucose is a molecule with 6 carbons, pyruvate only has 3 carbons, which means this carbon glucose can broken down into 2,3-carbon pyruvate molecules, and during this reaction in which glucose becomes 2 molecules of pyruvate. There are no literally major byproducts that can produce. However, we will yield some ATP. Unfortunately, glycolysis doesn't result in a lot of ATP, which means we can't perform glycolysis for too long or rely on too much for our source of energy. The main reason of it is that it is because glycolysis only produces 2 molecules of ATP. 2 molecules is really not a lot. That's why we need to perform. There is another steps during cell respiration to give us the energy that we need to carry on in our daily lives. The second step of it is no longer occurs in cytoplasm. Instead, the second molecules or the 2 molecules of pyruvate that we just produced will move on somewhere else. So what will happen to the 2 molecules pyruvate? They are actually moved from cytoplasm directly into the mitochondria after series of modifications. As soon as pyruvate moves into mitochondria, we can begin the second step, known as citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle. Krebs cycle is not in the cytoplasm anymore. We move on from cytoplasm into the powerhouse of the cell, which we may remember is the mitochondria. The 2 molecules of pyruvate that we produce during glycolysis would move on with the reactants of our next reaction. As a result of Krebs cycle, pyruvate become a product. In this case of pyruvate will turn some high energy electron carriers. You may see these high energy electron carriers written as the NADH and FADH2. Again, in the mitochondria, pyruvate turns into the high energy electrons. By the byproducts of this reaction is carbon dioxide. Remember, when humans are breathing, we're eating sugar and breathing oxygen. We always exhale carbon dioxide as a waste product. And that carbon dioxide comes from, you'll know that the stepping which occurs is the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. Carbon dioxide gas is a byproduct of this reaction where pyruvate becomes electron carriers. During the Krebs cycle, the number of ATP that we produce is still not a lot. It is not enough to power the reactions of daily life. Unfortunately, Krebs cycle able to provide us with 2 molecules of ATP. The third and final step is continuous in mitochondria. We're still in mitochondria and we are going to use this time the high energy electron carriers to produce our product. In mitochondria, we have this high energy of electron carriers, bringing electron down a chain, and the only logical name for this system or step is electron transport chain. Because what are we doing? We are moving this electron from very low electronegativity down carrier to carrier until our very last carrier is extremely electronegative. That's why in its chain. The main product of this reaction, unlike being an intermediate, is actually ATP. So all of this was done, but the goal and intention of producing a ton of ATP through the electron transport chain. As of the byproducts, I pointed out earlier that the electron transport chain were pulling the electron to carriers with increasing electronegativity. You might remember that the most electronegative atom that we look at this reaction is oxygen. Oxygen is the final electronic acceptor when it accepts the electron. It also accepts 2 protons or 2 hydrogen ions. When this happens, you have an oxygen and 2 hydrogen. You produce water. The most importantly, the number of ATP that we produce in this final step clearly outweighs to ATP that we produce before or earlier. During the electron transport chain, we produce an amazing 28 molecules of ATP. Some sources you've seen say that you are producing 30 or 32 ATP molecules. And the answer of it is really just depends in whether you are using NADH or FADH2. It depends on high energy of carriers that is involved in the reaction. Yun na nga po, dun na po nagtatapos ang aming video presentation. Ako po si May Altibay at kapartner ko pang si Cindy Gabriel. So thank you po and God bless us all.